All right, buckle up, because today we're diving into a story that's got it all. Brotherly loyalty, conspiracies, and a turning point in American labor history. We're talking about James B. McNamara and the 1910 Los Angeles Times bombing.
A story that still has the power to shock, even over a century later.
You sent over some excerpts from his Wikipedia page, which I have to say is surprisingly gripping.
It really is. You find court records, letters. It's like stepping back in time.
It paints a vivid picture of the era, too. I mean, this wasn't some fringe figure. McNamara was right at the heart of a huge struggle.
Absolutely. You can't understand him without understanding the context. The rise of industry, the power of corporations like U.S. Steel, unions fighting for their very existence.
It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And explode it did. Yeah. But let's back up a bit. McNamara wasn't born into this world of violence. He started out as a regular guy, born in 1882, same year as Teddy Roosevelt's first wife, by the way.
Huh, interesting. So, born into an America on the cusp of huge change.
Right. And as he grew up, he saw firsthand the growing gap between the haves and have-nots. It's no surprise he was drawn to the labor movement, joined the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, the IW, in his early 20s.
The guys building the skyscrapers that were transforming the American skyline?
Exactly. They were literally shaping the future, but often working in dangerous conditions for low wages.
So the IW was on the front lines of this battle against corporate giants like U.S. Steel.
They were, and U.S. Steel and others were fighting back with tactics like the open shop movement.
Okay, I gotta admit, I'm a little fuzzy on that. Wasn't the open shop supposed to be about giving workers more choice?
Well, that was the idea they pushed. But in reality, it was more about undermining unions. Think about it. If you're a worker and you know your employer prefers non-union labor, are you really free to choose?
Ah, I see. So it creates this unspoken pressure, almost like a loyalty test.
Exactly. It chips away at the union's power, making it harder to bargain effectively,
It's a much more subtle tactic than, say, outright union busting.
but no less effective. And it helps to explain why someone like McNamara, who started out as a union man, would eventually resort to violence. Because by 1909, he was already using dynamite in what he saw as a desperate fight for survival.
And that brings us to the event that would make him infamous. The bombing of the Los Angeles Times building on October 1st, 1910.
A horrific act of violence that killed 21 people and sent shockwaves across the nation.
The pictures of the wreckage are just devastating. The Times building was literally reduced to rubble. And to think, McNamara used a time bomb, what they called a clock machine back then, to pull it off.
It speaks to the level of planning, the cold-bloodedness of the act. And what's even more chilling is that he didn't just disappear after the bombing. McNamara went on the run and continued planting bombs, at least 5 more, in March of 1911 alone.
It's hard to wrap your head around that. This wasn't just a one-time act of desperation. It was a sustained campaign of terror.
Driven by an ideology that had twisted into something dark and dangerous. And it set the stage for one of the most intense manhunts in American history. The authorities brought in the big guns, William J. Burns,
William J. Burns, the founder of the Burns Detective Agency.
but one and only. They were like the FBI of their day, known for their cutting-edge methods. Burns was a master of investigation, a real pioneer in the field.
So this was no ordinary detective chasing a petty thief. This was a clash of titans. The relentless detective versus the phantom bomber, a nationwide drama playing out in the headlines.
It was a spectacle that captivated the nation. And as the net closed in, the stakes just kept getting higher. It was like watching a game of chess, with each move more daring than the last. And finally, in April 1911, Burns cornered them, both James and his brother, John J. McNamara, all the way up in Detroit.
So they were finally brought to justice. I bet that was a huge relief for everyone involved.
Well, not so fast. The arrest was just the beginning. What came next was even more fascinating. The trial.
Ah, yes, the trial. It turned into a major public spectacle, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The whole country was watching. And the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, they were convinced the McNamaras were innocent, that they were being framed.
Framed? By who?
By the Times owner, Harrison Gray Otis, a powerful man with a strong anti-union stance. The AFL even went so far as to accuse him of staging the bombing himself.
Whoa, hold on. They thought he blew up his own building to discredit the unions. That's a pretty wild accusation.
It sounds crazy, right? But that's how deep the distrust ran between labor and capital back then. Both sides saw this trial as a make-or-break moment, a chance to win over public opinion.
So it was more than just a legal battle. It was a battle for hearts and minds.
Exactly. And into this already charged atmosphere steps Clarence Darrow, Probably the most famous defense attorney in the country at that time.
Ah, Clarence Darrow, the lawyer who defended Scopes in the Scopes monkey trial? That Clarence Darrow.
The very same. He was known for his sharp wit, his eloquence, and his passion for defending the underdog. And he took on the McNamara case, seeing it as a chance to not just defend two brothers, but to defend the very ideals of the labor movement.
I can only imagine the courtroom drama. So how did Darrow approach the defense? Did he go all in on proving their innocence?
Well, it was shaping up to be a real clash of the titans. You had the prosecution with a seemingly strong case, and then Darrow, a master manipulator of juries, playing on public sympathy and the deep division surrounding the case. It seemed like a hung jury was a real possibility. But then, boom, a twist no one saw coming.
What happened? Did they find some new evidence?
Even more dramatic than that. McNamara's accomplice, the guy who actually helped plant the bombs, he confessed.
Wait, their own guy turned on them, just
Yeah.
like that.
It was a complete bombshell. McManagle's testimony was detailed, corroborated, there was no escaping it. And Darrow, always the pragmatist, he realized the game was up. He knew they couldn't win.
So what did he do? Throw in the towel?
Not exactly. He did what he thought was best for his clients. He managed to negotiate a plea deal. Convinced both brothers to plead guilty in exchange for lighter sentences. James B. got life, John J. 15 years.
Still a pretty hefty sentence, even with a plea deal.
It was. And it was a devastating blow for the AFL. They had put so much faith in the McNamaras, believed so strongly in their innocence, and then, bam, a guilty plea.
I imagine that really shook the labor movement to its core.
It did. For some, it was proof that unions were harboring dangerous radicals. For others, it just solidified their belief that the system was rigged against them. But for James B. McNamara, it meant a life behind bars at San Quentin. It would have been easy for his story to end there, just another tragic figure swallowed up by the prison system.
Yeah, a footnote in history. But you mentioned something earlier about these McNamara papers, right? What's the story with those?
Ah, right. These papers are actually a treasure trove of information. They're housed at the University of Cincinnati, and they offer a really unique window into McNamara's thoughts, long after the dust had settled. Letters to Clarence Darrow, correspondence with Upton Sinclair, who, by the way, was super interested in the case.
So he didn't just disappear into the prison system. He kept writing, kept thinking out what happened.
He did. And the letters aren't some big dramatic confession or anything, but you do see glimpses of a man wrestling with his actions, the weight of what he had done. Like in one letter to Darrow, he actually expresses regret for the lives lost, but then in the same breath defends his motives, saying he felt like he had no other choice, that he had to protect the workers from exploitation.
So a mix of remorse and justification. That's a tough pill to swallow, especially considering the scale of the tragedy.
It is. But it also reflects the moral dilemmas of that era. The labor struggle was so intense, so violent at times, that the line between activism and extremism got really blurry. It makes you think, what happens when peaceful methods fail? How far is too far when you're fighting for what you believe in?
It's easy for us to judge from our comfortable position in the 21st century, but back then it was a different world.
It was. And for McNamara, those weren't just abstract questions. They were the reality he lived with every day. They shaped his choices, led him down a path of destruction, and ultimately to a lifetime of confinement. And yet, even behind bars, his story continued to resonate.
You mentioned earlier that there were actually campaigns for his release.
There were. The sources I saw talked about several organizations that took up his cause. Some were labor groups, obviously, who saw him as a kind of martyr for the movement. But there were others, too, groups like the National Federation for Constitutional Liberties.
Wait, the National Federation for Constitutional Liberties, weren't they more focused on, civil liberties issues?
They were. But they argued that McNamara's sentence was excessive, that he had served enough time. Others continued to claim he was innocent, a victim of a conspiracy.
So even decades after the bombing, people were still debating his guilt, still arguing about what justice really meant in this case.
It became a symbol, a rallying cry for different causes. And it just shows how history isn't always neat and tidy. It's messy, full of contradictions. And the echoes of the past can linger for a very long time.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a reminder that we're still grappling with some of the same issues today. The fight for workers' rights, the balance of power between labor and capital, the line between activism and extremism. These things are still very much alive.
Absolutely. And the McNamara case, it forces us to confront these questions head on. It challenges us to think critically about the past and to apply those lessons to the world we live in today.
It really is amazing how one man's story like this just opens up so many different avenues of thought. Like, we've gone from the world of early 20th century labor struggles to detective work to like a deep dive into the mind of a man who is driven to do something so extreme.
And it all comes back to that question, like, how does someone who dedicated their life to protecting workers, how do they become a bomber who ends up taking innocent lives?
Yeah, it's so easy to just look back and judge what he did, but you said it before, you can't separate a person from their context. Back then the lines were a lot more blurred, violence was more common in these labor disputes, and the power dynamics were so different.
Right. We can't just impose our modern day values onto the past, but we can learn from it. The McNamara case, it forces us to really grapple with these complex
Hmm.
ideas. You
Yeah.
know, ideology, the dangers of extremism, the consequences of actions that are taken in the name of some greater good, even if the outcome is bad.
And it makes me wonder, like, has the relationship between labor and capital really changed all that much since then? I mean, sure, we don't see bombings like the Times event anymore, but there's still tension. There's still that struggle for power and fairness.
Oh, absolutely. We see it playing out in different ways now. Debates about automation, globalization, the gig economy, the battleground might be different,
Right.
but the core issues are still there. Workers are still fighting for fair wages and safe conditions and a voice in the decisions that impact their lives.
So the echoes of the McNamara case, they're still reverberating today in a way. It makes you think, like, what are we willing to fight for, and where do we draw that line between advocating for change and going too far?
Those are questions everyone has to answer for themselves. And the McNamara story, it shows us that there aren't always easy answers. History is rarely black and white. It's more about the lessons and challenges and engaging with the complexity of the world.
That's well said. For me, this deep dive has been a real eye opener. I came in thinking this was just a historical footnote, but it's turned out to be so much more than that.
That's the beauty of exploration, isn't it? You never know what you'll find. And for those who want to go even deeper, I'd highly recommend checking out Orty McManigal's account of the bombings. It's a really fascinating read, and the McNamara papers at the University of Cincinnati, they're a gold mine of information.
I'll definitely be checking those out. And for our listeners who want to learn more about this era in general, I think exploring the history of the IW and the impact of the open shop movement would be a great place to start.
It's a fascinating period of American history for sure.
Well, that just about wraps up our deep dive into the world of James B. McNamara. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and as always, keep those minds curious.